Hello, everybody. I'm Parth. I'm joining from Augmentation Lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Very excited to be here. All right, Augmentation Lab started off as a hacker house. We spun out of MIT Media Lab. We are a dozen hackers, researchers, scientists all across the country that come here every summer to explore augmentation technologies. We build artificial wombs, neural limbs, exoskeletons, wearables, everything interesting and futuristic. And the core premise here is not just to build, but to think what we're building and to develop a strong thesis around what we are going to be building and how the future should look like, and make sure that the public, the layman, is not left behind in that conversation. And I think Ekkolapto is doing very similar and adjacent work to that. And I'm very happy to be here and representing Aglab. Today, I'll be talking about some of the ideas that it's going to be a cogent representation of a few of the things that I've thought about in the last few months. Um, I think we're living in a time where life makes little to no sense. And coming from a background of both philosophy and then now working in community building, having dabbled in finance a little, I know that markets behave very differently than most people think they do. It's less about the actual value of the goods and more about the meaning we impute on them. And I want to sort of talk about how AI is going to affect the future, um, both the markets and the religions. And the connecting factor between these two things is actually that both markets and religions are simply coordination mechanisms at scale. Um, so one thing I recently noticed is how a lot of the people, especially in the younger generation, feel very disillusioned by the technologies that we are using these days and the present we are part of and the future we are heading towards. But we've never been more abundant in throughout the history of time. Like we have more than people 100 years ago had. The poverty rates have been the lowest. The life expectancy has been the highest. We have the knowledge of the world on our fingertips, quite literally. And yet somehow all the abundance does not beget happiness. And I think that to think like in this framework is to actually misunderstand the very nature of capitalism. Because capitalism doesn't just work around the value creation centered around the goods. It actually does by creating value by meaning. What does that mean? We don't buy goods, we don't buy items on the shelf. We instead consume the stories and the meaning behind them. We translate and trade intangibles. That means the belief systems, the cultural values, the core selling premises of the goods instead of buying items on the um, shelf. And we can see this in here in the chart that I have here. Like we're mostly trading in the intangible assets now. And this graph is only ever going to increase. And the way we actually deal with the intangibles is through stories. And one of the famous quotes that I really like is that the shortest distance between two people is just a story. And I think that that could be summarized, um, that could summarize most of like how value creation happens today. Um, the marketing budget spends explain that. But I want to sort of draw back a little and use this analogy of how we are using trading in intangibles to figure out why a lot of people are disillusioned now. And the reason is that the stories that we consume are actually failing us, right? The 60/40, for example, split was a story that we told ourselves, and it worked for some time, and then it didn't. The Billionaire Genius was a story that was told to us, but then turned out with FTX that doesn't work either. The tech savior, the Messiah, that doesn't work out. The impenetrable Russian army machine, that doesn't work out either. The red wave that never came, the Fed put, and there are countless number of stories, right? And these stories that are being fed to us, there is a way forward, but I think to understand the way forward, we have to understand that what these stories do to us. Um, And to understand that, I think I would want to talk about Nick Bostrom's infamous paperclip maximizer experiment. He talks about how in the future of AI, um, if we have an AI with the benign goal of just producing paperclips, and if it's not aligned with the human intention of producing paperclips within the certain constraints, it would actually go around creating paperclips out of just about anything up until all the resources of Earth are exhausted to produce paperclips, turning the entire Earth into a paperclip factory. And I think it's the most compelling analogy to the world we are in right now. Um, we're not producing paperclips. I think we're producing stories. We're producing these like very short-lived narratives to try and understand the meaning around us to make our lives less absurd. Um, and and I think that the best way I can explain the disillusionment, especially amongst the young people, is that because we're producing meaning, producing these stories at such a fast rate, we're actually entering what I'm calling the meaning inflation, the story inflation, which is that there's just too many stories in the market. And and I think that in a world moving forward, we'll have to figure out exactly how the market of meaning is going to work. And that would include understanding the scarcity mechanisms that we have for the goods right now, but implementing those scarcity mechanisms for medium going forward. But the interesting part is that if you juxtapose the need of scarcity in story production with the fact that we will now be able to produce infinite content, hyper personalized for every single person out there in the world, those two things don't sit together really well. Um, and that is to me, if not the most uh, problematic thing that I think about, and I do not have the solution for. Uh, Trying to understand how to create really strong stories the when the story creation process is now infinitely cheaper and scalable. And the answer to this question is going to be the answer to the question of how we can solve for disillusionment amongst the younger generations.
Do you have any comments on the relationship between narrative and people's personal identity? I've been chewing on this, and I think personal identity is a pretty key element, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Interestingly enough, I think the only way you form an identity is through the negative. Hegel talks about this, where your identity comes not from who you are, but from who you are not. So it's the juxtaposition of the self versus the other. And I think like we are, as the world has homogenized in the last 30 years because of the internet, uh, we have seen that our identities actually become more flimsier. We don't have strong sense of identities. What narratives do instead is that narratives like try to overcompensate for lacking identities by pigeonholing a lot of people together into these like nice little buckets. But as we're seeing, that doesn't actually work when there's too many of these happening at the same time. Um, so I think like there would be a resurgence of identities uh, by actually going back a little in the sense where like I don't think we're going to go back to like pre-technology, but I think we're going to go back to a world where people have much stronger identities because the world is less homogenized. And that will happen through, again, that this sort of like is a detour to what I'm doing, but I think like community building is going to be a central part of the future, where we're going to see a lot of like subcultures and communes and homesteads and communities propping up. Um, and people will develop their identities based on that instead of the narratives as they do today.
Wonderful. Now, real quick, just as we wrap up here, where can everybody find you online and what you're working on?
Yes, I'm building VibeCheck. It's a social media platform for finding relationships and helping your friends find relationships. And yeah, and you can find me on my Twitter. It's x.com/Rana G Who, RANAGWHO.
Awesome. And you're going to hear much more from him later on in the Ekkolapto community and for the Augmentation Lab Summit. It's going to be the coolest thing you've ever seen. We'll be plugging that on all the Ekkolapto channels for people to go. But thank you, Rana G.
All right, thank you so much, guys.